shadows of candlelight flicker across forgotten castles, where icy crowns weighed heavy upon hearts, and the echo of royal footsteps carried whispers of cruelty through stone corridors. Cold halls remember queens, whose rule was wrapped in fear. Welcome, dear listener, to this gentle nighttime journey. I'm so glad you're here, and I invite you to simply rest, breathe, and let the stories carry you softly into the night. If you enjoy these calm explorations of history, feel free, only if you'd like, to like and subscribe. You might also share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always comforting to know we're connected across the world, together in this quiet moment. So dim the lights, perhaps turn on a soft fan or settle deeper into bed. Let your body grow heavy and your mind unhurried. Tonight, we turn the pages of the past and step carefully into a darker chapter, the cruelest queens in European history. In the glittering courts of medieval Europe, power was wrapped in symbols. The crown of gold, the heavy sceptre, the velvet throne, each object was more than decoration. They carried weight, meaning, and silent authority. A crown was not just a circle of precious metal. It was the mark of divine right, of a ruler chosen to lead. A sceptre was not a mere ornament. It was the sign that decisions, life or death, rested in one woman's hand. But symbols are strange things. What begins as a token of trust can slowly become an emblem of fear. The same crown that sparkled in candlelight could cast a shadow in people's minds. The same throne that promised justice could become a seat of cruelty. In the hands of queens remembered as the harshest in European history, these sacred objects took on darker meanings. Let us begin with the crown. In ceremony it shone above all else, catching the light of the church as choirs sang. For subjects it meant stability, protection and order. But when a queen ruled with suspicion, when her gaze was cold and unforgiving, the crown became something more dreadful. It was no longer the mark of care, but of domination. When her people looked at it, they did not see safety. They saw a weight pressing down, a reminder that mercy could vanish at the queen's will. The sceptre, too, carried this double nature. Raised in blessing, it could mean peace. Raised in judgment, it could mean execution. In courts filled with whispers, nobles watched the movement of that sceptre like a signal of fate. For them, its polished surface reflected not only jewels, but also their own fears. When Catherine de' Medici held it, it was said her presence alone filled the room with unease. The golden staff looked less like a symbol of law and more like a weapon of hidden intentions. And then there was the throne itself, carved of oak, lined with silk or brocade. It was meant to be the heart of justice. Yet for many it became the stage upon which terror was performed. When Mary of England sat upon it, those who opposed her faith knew what would follow. The throne was no longer just a seat. It was the first step toward fire, trial, and punishment. These symbols of power, shining and revered, were supposed to guide nations. But in darker reigns they guided fear instead. The people bowed before the crown not out of love, but out of dread. They kissed the sceptre not out of devotion, but in desperate hope to survive another day. History reminds us that objects are never only what they seem. A jewel, a staff, a chair, they are empty without the meaning humans give them. And when a queen gave them the meaning of cruelty, the objects themselves seemed to change. In stories whispered across Europe, people remembered the crown as heavy with blood, the sceptre as sharp as a blade, the throne as cold as a tomb. This is how symbols turn to terror, and it is here, in these uneasy transformations, that the cruelest queens of Europe left their first marks upon history. The crown is perhaps the most familiar image of royalty. To imagine a queen without it feels almost impossible. Gold, silver, pearls and gemstones all woven into a circle that rests upon the head. From afar it looks like the highest honour a human being can wear. But to those who bore it, the crown was never light. Its weight was both real and symbolic. Queens often described how their necks ached beneath it, and how their minds too carried its unseen heaviness. In Europe's turbulent courts, the crown was more than a treasure, it was a burden. It demanded endless vigilance. A queen who wore it had to prove, every day, that she was worthy of its sparkle. If she faltered, enemies would whisper. Nobles would gather in secret. Faithful allies might turn their eyes elsewhere. The crown sat firmly on the queen's brow, but in truth it was always slipping, always at risk of being taken away. For some rulers, this pressure twisted their reign. What began as duty turned into suspicion. They looked at courtiers not as trusted companions, but as rivals. Even family members seemed dangerous. The crown whispered in their minds that to be safe, one must be harsh. Mercy looked like weakness. Kindness seemed like an invitation for betrayal. Thus, the crown became not a gift, but a chain. Take the case of Mary I of England. When she first claimed the throne, she carried the weight of restoring her faith to the land. The crown pressed its expectation upon her, reminding her at every turn that half the realm doubted her rule. In her hands, the crown became both shield and weapon. Shield, because it gave her the authority to silence voices against her. Weapon, because it allowed her to command fire and judgment upon those she named heretics. To her, the burden of the crown left no room for leniency. To the people, it meant terror cloaked in royal ceremony. For others, like Catherine de' Medici, the crown was a double-edged tool. France trembled with conflict, and she carried the responsibility of keeping her sons on the throne. Her crown was not a shining ornament, it was a constant reminder that survival demanded cunning, and so she used it. She wielded her royal image like a blade, cutting down rivals through plots and poisons. In her court, the crown was not just worn, it was brandished, a visible warning that power could be both dazzling and deadly. The burden of the crown also lay in its isolation. Queens, even when surrounded by courtiers, were alone in their decisions. The golden circle reminded them of that solitude. It separated them from the people, from their friends, even from their own kin. And as loneliness deepened, so did the edge of cruelty. A queen who bore the crown too long often forgot how to trust. She saw rebellion in every corner and resistance in every glance. In this way, the crown was not only a burden but also a weapon. It pressed down on the queen's heart, and it pushed her hand toward ruthless acts. It gleamed brightly in ceremonies, but its shine concealed the darkness it demanded. History remembers the crown not just as a jewel of kings and queens, but as a test of their souls. Those who carried its burden with gentleness are praised, but those who let its weight harden their hearts are remembered as the cruelest. For them, the crown was not simply worn, it was wielded. In the grand halls of European palaces, loyalty was spoken of often. Oaths were sworn before altars, contracts sealed with wax, and nobles pledged service with bent knees. Words of faithfulness filled the air like music. Yet beneath those polished promises, another force worked quietly, stronger, sharper, and far more enduring than loyalty. That force was fear. Loyalty, after all, is fragile. It depends on love, respect, or shared belief. It can grow strong, but it can also wither quickly when tested. A noble may feel loyal to his queen, but if his lands are threatened or his life endangered, how deep will that loyalty run? History shows that many oaths, no matter how solemn, were broken in a single night when fortune changed. Fear, however, held fast. Fear reached into the bones, it crept into a man's dreams. Unlike loyalty, it did not ask for choice, it demanded obedience. And for queens who ruled in turbulent times, fear became a tool more reliable than devotion. Mary I of England understood this with chilling clarity. When she saw resistance rise against her attempt to restore her faith, she did not rely on love to win her people's hearts. Instead, she lit fires. Public executions were staged not only to punish, but to teach. The message was plain: oppose the crown, and flames await you. Those who might have whispered against her fell silent, not because they admired her, but because they feared the smoke rising from Smithfield. Loyalty could not have silenced them so effectively. Fear did. Catherine de' Medici, too, learned the power of terror. France in her time was a land divided, faith against faith, family against family. She knew affection was too uncertain to keep her dynasty secure, so she orchestrated moments that sent shivers through the realm, most infamously the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day. Thousands perished, and though the rivers of Paris ran red, the survivors understood a truth. The Queen Mother was not to be tested. Fear carved a deeper mark in memory than loyalty ever could. Even beyond the bloodiest reigns, the psychology of power leaned toward dread. In courts across Europe, nobles bowed low not simply out of respect but out of calculation. To fail in courtesy, to misspeak, to appear disloyal, each carried the risk of ruin. Queens did not need to raise their voices. The knowledge that they could was enough. The crown's jewels glittered in the torchlight, but behind that glitter was the sharp edge of consequences. Fear also gave queens something loyalty never could: constancy. A loyal servant may remain true in calm years but drift away in storms. Fear, once planted, endured. It kept men from plotting openly, kept women from speaking out, kept entire communities in rigid silence. Where love might fail, terror succeeded. And for rulers desperate to hold on to fragile thrones, success mattered more than affection. Yet this reliance on fear left scars. Subjects who obeyed out of dread remembered their queens not with fondness but with unease. Stories passed down through generations spoke less of loyalty and more of terror. The names of these queens were whispered long after their deaths, not in gratitude but in warning. In the end, fear proved to be the stronger chain. It bound people more tightly than loyalty ever could. It kept thrones upright when love would have crumbled. But it also ensured that the legacy of these queens would be remembered not with warmth, but with a chill that lingers even centuries later. In medieval Europe, religion was not only a matter of belief, it was the very fabric of life. From the moment a child was born, prayers surrounded them. Bells rang from churches to mark the hours of the day. Festivals, seasons, marriages, even the harvest, all were guided by faith. For a queen, this made religion more than a spiritual guide. It was a powerful tool, one that could shape nations and command obedience. Unlike loyalty, which wavered, or fear, which could turn to rebellion, faith touched the deepest part of the human mind. People did not see it as the queen's command, but as God's will. And so, when rulers tied their power to religion, their control spread far beyond soldiers and swords. It reached the hearts of peasants, the voices of priests, and the decisions of nobles. Isabella of Castile understood this truth with clarity. Her crown was heavy not only with jewels but with a mission. She believed her rule was sacred, chosen to defend the faith. Through this belief, she justified acts that might otherwise seem unthinkable. The Spanish Inquisition, under her reign, became a force that shaped every corner of her realm. People were told that to disobey the Queen was to disobey God himself. It was no longer politics. It was salvation or damnation. This blending of throne and altar gave her unmatched influence. Villagers who might resist attacks could not resist a sermon. A noble who might challenge her authority would hesitate to challenge the church. Fear of punishment was strong, but fear of eternal punishment was stronger still. The fires of the Inquisition did more than consume bodies. They consumed resistance, leaving behind a population bound by both earthly law and heavenly dread. Other queens, too, wielded faith as their sharpest weapon. Mary I of England, raised in devotion to the old religion, tied her rule to the return of her church. In her eyes, every execution of a Protestant was not only political but holy. The flames that burned in London were, to her, purifying fires. By rooting her cruelty in faith, she gave it an authority beyond herself. She was not simply a queen punishing heretics. She was, in her mind, an instrument of God. For subjects, this union of faith and power was nearly impossible to resist. A law could be questioned, a queen could be disliked, but salvation could not be risked. People who might whisper against their ruler in secret remained silent when priests thundered from pulpits. Even those who doubted kept their doubts hidden, knowing that disbelief was not merely treason but sin. Faith as a tool of control was effective because it blurred the line between obedience and devotion. To follow the Queen was not only to avoid punishment, it was to save one's soul. And so people knelt, prayed, and obeyed, even when their hearts trembled. Yet history shows the danger of this power. Queens who ruled through faith left behind divided nations, scarred by persecution and suspicion. Their control, though strong, came at the cost of unity. When faith was used not to guide but to command, it turned into a chain heavier than any crown. In the quiet halls of history, we remember them not only as rulers, but as figures who proved that belief, when bound to authority, could become the sharpest tool of all. Faith, once meant to comfort, became the reason people lived in fear. The story of the Inquisition is remembered most vividly through fire. In town squares and open fields, wooden stakes were raised, and bundles of straw were stacked high. Crowds gathered in silence, their faces pale with dread, for they knew what was coming. The fire was not only a punishment, it was a message. It told every man, woman, and child that disobedience to faith, and to the queen who guarded it, would end in flames. In Isabella of Castile's Spain, the Inquisition became the sharpest edge of royal power. Priests and judges robed in black moved through villages and cities questioning, accusing, and recording names. Families who had lived side by side for generations suddenly looked at one another with suspicion. Was the neighbour truly a Christian, or did he secretly cling to old beliefs? Was a friend's silence at prayer a sign of devotion, or of hidden heresy? Fear spread faster than any sermon. When a trial ended with a sentence of death, it did not happen in secret. The Queen and her officials understood the value of spectacle. The condemned were led out into the open, their garments marked with symbols of sin, their faces pale but resigned. At the centre of the square, the stake awaited. Timber cracked as it was bound together, and the crowd shifted nervously, torn between pity and terror. Children clung to their mothers. Merchants closed their stalls. No one wished to be absent, for absence could be seen as sympathy, and sympathy was dangerous. As the torches touched the straw, the air filled with smoke. Flames rose, orange against the sky, and the heat pushed back the onlookers. The cries of the condemned echoed, sometimes with prayers, sometimes with silence. The Queen herself did not need to be present. Her power was there in the fire, in the fear that settled into every heart watching. These burnings were not just punishments for individuals, they were performances, carefully staged reminders that loyalty to crown and faith could never be questioned. The fires of the Inquisition burned away more than lives. They burned away trust between neighbours. They burned away the sense of safety within homes. They burned away the idea that private belief could remain private. Under the smoke, families whispered to each other in the night, wondering if a careless word might bring suspicion, or if a rival might whisper their name to an inquisitor. Yet strangely, the flames also gave rulers a kind of grim security. Each execution tightened the grip of the crown, each spectacle reminding the people that resistance was hopeless. Those who watched went home, shaken, but they went home obedient. They crossed themselves more carefully, spoke with greater caution, and prayed louder in the churches. The fires did not just punish heresy, they taught conformity. Centuries later, when people remembered these times, they did not recall the gold of the crown or the splendour of royal palaces first. They recalled the fires. They recalled the smoke rising into the night and the feeling that faith had turned into a torch that burned the innocent as well as the guilty. The Inquisition claimed to defend belief, but in practice it ruled by fear. Its flames lit not only the bodies of those condemned, but also the imagination of all who lived under its shadow. And in that glow, queens like Isabella secured their control. The fires may have died, the wood turned to ash, but the memory of those flames continues to smoulder in history's pages, a symbol of how far rulers would go when faith became their weapon. When the flames of the Inquisition finally faded, their smoke did not vanish with the wind. It lingered, not in the air, but in memory. Villages, towns, and even great cities carried scars that could not be seen, yet were felt in every conversation, every cautious glance, every whispered prayer. This was the true legacy. Not only the deaths, but the divisions they left behind. Families who had once shared meals across long wooden tables no longer trusted one another. A neighbour's silence seemed suspicious. A merchant's hesitation at a church door invited questions. People learned to guard their tongues, not out of politeness, but out of fear. To speak too freely, even about small things, was dangerous. A joke, a forgotten ritual, a misplaced word could lead to ruin. The Inquisition might have passed, but the fear it spread settled like a permanent shadow over daily life. In Spain, the crown and the church had hoped to create unity, a kingdom where every subject was bound by the same faith, the same customs, the same loyalty. But the methods they chose bred division instead. Old wounds deepened. Those who converted under pressure were never fully trusted, no matter how loudly they prayed. Their descendants carried that burden, marked by suspicion long after the trials ended. Communities that once thrived on cooperation now lived in quiet tension. This legacy of division reached far beyond private homes. It shaped the very fabric of the kingdom. Trade slowed when merchants distrusted one another. Learning withered when books were burned and teachers silenced. Art and expression narrowed, confined to what was safe and approved. The human spirit, which thrives on openness, found itself bound in chains of silence. A society that might have flourished with diversity instead closed itself in, fearful of difference, fearful of questioning, fearful even of thought. And yet rulers considered this a success. To them, obedience mattered more than harmony. As long as people remained divided among themselves, they posed no united threat to the crown. Fear was not just a consequence, it was a tool. If fearful people are easier to rule than a hopeful one, the queens who presided over these times may have secured their thrones, but they also planted seeds of mistrust that endured for centuries. Travellers from other lands noticed it. They wrote of a Spain that was grand in ceremony, rich in gold from its colonies, but strangely subdued in spirit. Its people bowed their heads, not just in prayer, but in caution. They spoke carefully, as if the Inquisition still listened, even when its fires no longer burned. The echo of fear outlived the institution itself. Generations later, families still told stories in hushed voices about ancestors accused, neighbours betrayed, friends lost to the Inquisitor's judgment. Children grew up with these tales as warnings. Be careful what you say. Be careful who you trust. Fear became an inheritance, passed down as surely as land or name. This was the enduring legacy, not the crown's glory, not the triumph of faith, but a society fractured by suspicion. Division and fear became threads woven into the fabric of daily life, threads that could not easily be pulled away. Even as new rulers rose and new ages dawned, the shadow of the Inquisition remained, reminding all who live beneath it that the cruelest power is not the one that takes lives, but the one that divides and unsettles the living. The flames may have died, but their memory lived on, shaping generations in silence. That was the true cost. A kingdom held together by fear, yet broken within by mistrust. Among the rulers of Europe, some wore their crowns in open light, their deeds proclaimed in marble halls, their victories carved into stone. But others ruled in silence, shaping their kingdoms not with parades and proclamations, but with whispers carried through dimly lit corridors. These were the queens of shadows and secrets, women whose true power thrived where the eyes of the world could not reach. History remembers such a queen in fragments, her name often spoken with unease. To her people she appeared regal, graceful, almost untouchable. Yet behind closed doors her court was alive with secret councils, hidden letters, and coded messages. Spies moved like invisible threads through the tapestry of her reign, weaving connections, unravelling plots, and binding enemies before they could even act. Her palace was no simple residence. By day it glittered with music, dancing, and the rustle of silk gowns. By night it transformed into a place of secrecy. Candles flickered in narrow chambers where the queen received only a chosen few. Trusted advisors, shadowy agents, and sometimes even foreign envoys who arrived in secret. She listened more than she spoke, and when she finally answered, her words carried both promise and warning. For those who served her, loyalty was not enough. She demanded silence as well. Secrets were a currency, and those who spent them carelessly soon found themselves ruined. A careless servant might vanish overnight. A noble who whispered too freely might lose title and land, and rumours of betrayal were enough to bring entire families under suspicion. The Queen's justice, when it appeared, seemed sudden, precise, and often without explanation. Yet it was through this veil of secrecy that she held her throne. Enemies could not strike what they could not see. Rivals who plotted found themselves exposed before their plans could blossom. Letters they thought hidden were already in her possession. Even the most powerful lords lowered their voices in her presence, unsure of how much she already knew. Fear of her knowledge, and the shadow she commanded, was often stronger than fear of her soldiers. But ruling through secrets came at a cost. The Queen herself lived in a world where trust was rare. Every friendship was shadowed by doubt. Even family ties could not be free of suspicion. She ate from golden plates, but wondered who might have touched the food. She slept beneath embroidered canopies, but woke in the night at the sound of a footstep in the hall. Her crown was steady on her head, yet her peace was fragile. Her people too lived with the weight of her shadow. Markets buzzed with whispers, but laughter was cautious. Songs were sung, but only those that praised. In taverns and kitchens, conversation stopped suddenly when an unfamiliar ear drew close. Everyone knew the Queen's agents moved among them, listening, collecting, reporting. The kingdom itself became an echo of her, brilliant in the light, watchful in the dark, careful always of what was spoken. In the end, her reign was remembered less for monuments or victories than for the atmosphere it left behind. A sense of eyes always watching, of truths always hidden. She was the queen of shadows and secrets, a figure both admired and feared, who built her throne not only from stone and gold, but from silence and suspicion. Her story reminds us that power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and in those whispers, entire kingdoms can be bound, ruled, and reshaped, though at a terrible price. In the grand halls of European courts, power rarely rested only in crowns and thrones. It often moved quietly, in hidden hands, in whispers exchanged behind heavy curtains, and in cups of wine poured too generously. Queens, too, became players in this unseen game, where plots were spun like delicate webs, and poisons were as deadly as swords. History tells of rulers who relied not on open battle but on silence and secrecy. A banquet might seem a place of celebration, with golden dishes and laughter rising toward painted ceilings. Yet beneath the glitter of jewels and candlelight suspicion lingered. Every goblet could be a trap. Every servant's hand might conceal a weapon. For a queen surrounded by rivals, survival meant seeing danger where others saw delight. Poison, in particular, became a symbol of this hidden struggle. It was invisible, silent, and merciless. A drop slipped into wine, a powder mixed with honey, a perfume touched to the skin. All could bring a slow and certain end. Unlike the fire of the Inquisition, or the sword of the battlefield, poison left no spectacle. It was quiet, like the fear that spread with it. A death by poison was not just an end to life, but a message: trust no one. Some queens were rumoured to keep hidden stores of such deadly tools, locked away in chests, guarded not by soldiers but by silence. They were said to experiment with small doses, watching how they worked, learning how to strike without leaving a trace. Whether these stories were true or not hardly mattered. The mere belief that a queen possessed such knowledge gave her power. A rival would hesitate before raising a challenge, wondering if the next feast might be their last. Plots too moved hand in hand with poison. In the shadows of the court, alliances shifted like sand. A smile could hide betrayal. A promise could mask ambition. Secret letters travelled across borders, sealed with wax but carrying treason within. Spies passed through kitchens, gardens, and chapels, carrying whispers back to the Queen's ear. And at the centre of it all, the ruler herself remained a figure of mystery, deciding when to act, when to wait, and when to let fear do her work. Yet such hidden power carried dangers of its own. A queen who ruled through secrets and poisons also ruled through suspicion. Trust vanished, not only between her and her enemies, but between her and her allies. Every noble in her court wondered if their loyalty was enough. Every servant feared that silence might not protect them forever. In time, the entire palace became a stage where everyone played a part, but no one knew which actor would fall next. Still, history cannot deny the effectiveness of such methods. Where armies might fail, poison succeeded. Where open justice bred rebellion, hidden plots ended it before it could rise. The queen who commanded these silent weapons kept her throne not only through strength, but through fear of the unseen. Centuries later, when tales of these courts were retold, they were filled with mystery, of queens whose smiles could not be trusted, of goblets raised with trembling hands, of hidden agents moving like shadows through candlelit halls. These were not stories of open conquest, but of delicate, dangerous games played in silence. Royal dynasties are often remembered for their splendour, for the gold of their palaces, the silk of their gowns, and the songs sung in their honour. But some are remembered for something darker, a trail of blood that seems to follow generation after generation, staining every crown and every throne they held. These were families where ambition outweighed mercy, and where cruelty passed down as easily as inheritance. In such a dynasty, a queen did not rise to power in peace. She inherited more than jewels and titles. She inherited enemies. Brothers, cousins, even children became rivals in a game where the prize was survival itself. Every coronation was shadowed by suspicion. Every marriage brought both alliance and danger. Blood was spilled not only in battlefields but in chambers, cellars and stairwells, where daggers and poison worked more swiftly than armies. Imagine a royal child growing up in such a court. She played beneath painted ceilings, but always under the watchful eyes of guards. She learned to smile while listening for whispers. At feasts she tasted her wine carefully, as if every sip might be her last. By the time she reached her throne, fear was no stranger. It was her constant companion. In a dynasty marked by blood, even innocence could not survive untouched. When such a queen ruled, her cruelty did not appear out of nowhere. It was the logic of her inheritance. She had seen her uncles executed, her cousins imprisoned, her own siblings plotted against. She knew that mercy could be fatal, and so she chose harshness, believing it was the only way to preserve her reign. Publicly, her dynasty displayed wealth and ceremony. Festivals were held, banners waved, and prayers rose in grand cathedrals. But beneath the surface, the truth was different. Families whispered of sudden disappearances. Soldiers marched not only to foreign borders, but also to the homes of nobles who had fallen from favour. The Queen's justice was swift, but it was also bloody. Each sentence carried not just the weight of law, but the memory of her dynasty's long tradition of cruelty. The people, too, carried this memory. They remembered rulers who had ordered burnings, executions, and secret trials. They remembered nights when the sound of hooves on cobblestones meant someone would not return by morning. Each generation seemed to inherit not only the rule of the dynasty, but also its terror. Fear became a family signature, as recognizable as the coat of arms carved above palace gates. Yet for all its violence, such a dynasty endured. Bloodshed, strangely, became its glue. Rivals feared to challenge it. Subjects obeyed rather than risk suspicion. Even foreign rulers approached with caution, wary of the dynasty's ruthless reputation. Power built on fear is fragile, yet for centuries it held, but the cost was great. The dynasty's name, which could have been remembered for glory, was remembered instead for cruelty. Its queens were not celebrated as mothers of nations or patrons of the arts, but as figures who carried on the legacy of blood. In their portraits, their eyes seemed to follow viewers with a warning, as if to say, this throne was never built on trust, only on survival. When we look back at these rulers, it is clear that the true inheritance of their dynasty was not gold or land, but violence. Each generation sharpened the blade passed down from the last, and each queen who wore the crown carried with her the burden of blood, a burden that history has never let fade. The Tudor dynasty is often remembered for its drama, the broken marriages of Henry VIII, the glitter of Elizabeth's court, the storms of politics and power. But beneath the splendour ran another story, one written not in gold but in flame. For in Tudor England, faith itself became a battlefield, and fire the weapon that claimed countless lives. The struggle began with the question of belief. England, long bound to Rome, found itself torn apart when Henry VIII cast aside the authority of the Pope. What followed was not peace, but decades of turbulence, as kings and queens rose to power with rival visions of what faith should look like. With each change of ruler, the rules of worship shifted. What was holy under one monarch became heresy under the next. Ordinary men and women, who wished only to pray in safety, now lived with the fear that their very devotion might condemn them. It was under Queen Mary I that the fires blazed brightest. Determined to restore Catholic faith after her father's break with Rome, she turned to harsh measures. Those who resisted were not merely debated, they were tried as heretics. And heretics, in her eyes, were to be burned. Across towns and villages, stakes were raised in marketplaces. Crowds gathered in silence, knowing they were about to witness a terrible ritual. The condemned, often ministers or scholars, were led forward, their hands bound, their faces pale but steady. Some prayed loudly, others sang hymns, their voices rising defiantly as wood was piled at their feet. Then, as the flames took hold, their cries and songs mingled with the crackle of fire. These burnings were not hidden. They were public lessons meant to terrify as much as to punish. Children clutched their mothers' hands, merchants closed their stalls, bells tolled as smoke rose into the sky. The Queen herself did not need to be present. The fire spoke for her. Each burning proclaimed, "The crown and the church are one, and disobedience will be reduced to ash." Yet the effect was not what she intended. Instead of binding the kingdom in unity, the flames deepened its divisions. Families were split apart, some clinging to Rome, others to reform. Friends betrayed one another out of fear, or simply vanished to escape the trials. The very air of England seemed thick with suspicion. In time, Mary earned a name that would follow her forever. Bloody Mary! When her reign ended, the fires died down, but the scars they left remained. Elizabeth I, her successor, sought a different path, balancing faith with caution. Yet even in her reign, suspicion lingered. England had been taught that belief was dangerous, that worship could kill as surely as a blade. For those who lived through it, the memory of faith and fire was impossible to forget. The sight of smoke rising above a city square, the sound of prayers turning into screams, the knowledge that the crown could turn belief itself into a crime, all became part of England's inheritance. The Tudor age gave the world Shakespeare, exploration, and splendour, but it also gave the memory of flames. And in those flames, we see how power, once joined with faith, can burn not only bodies, but the very soul of a nation. In every age of power, rulers feared not only armies at their borders, but voices within their own walls. Dissent, the quiet murmur of disagreement, the whispered question, the bold refusal, was more dangerous than any sword. For a single voice could inspire others, and together they could shake a throne. To silence these voices, queens turned once again to fire. But in the flames that consumed their subjects, they also kindled doubts that would never truly die. Picture a town square at dawn. The air is cold, mist clings to the cobblestones, and crowds gather in silence. At the centre stands a wooden stake piled high with straw and timber. A man or woman is led forward, their hands bound, their face pale but unbowed. Their crime is not theft or treason, but words spoken, words that challenge the Queen's authority, or the Church's teaching, or the Crown's control. The punishment is fire, chosen not only for its cruelty, but for its visibility. The ruler's message is clear: dissent will be burned away. Yet dissent is not so easily destroyed. Those who watched often went home trembling, yet they also went home remembering. The sight of a neighbour's courage, the sound of prayers shouted above the flames, lingered long after the smoke drifted into the sky. And in private, many began to wonder, if the truth were so strong, why must it be defended by fire? Queens who relied on such burnings often believed they were protecting their kingdoms. To them, dissent threatened unity. One voice against the crown might inspire hundreds more. But their methods betrayed a deeper fear, the fear that their power rested on fragile ground. By burning the bodies of dissenters, they hoped to erase their ideas. Instead, they gave those ideas a martyr's fire. In taverns and marketplaces, people spoke cautiously, but spoke nonetheless. They questioned why a ruler needed such violence if she was truly just. They whispered whether God's will could truly require the screams of the faithful. And though most remained outwardly obedient, inwardly they carried doubts. Fire could consume flesh, but it could not silence thought. Over time, the burnings created a paradox. The Queen's power seemed absolute, yet the very need for such spectacles revealed her insecurity. Each execution announced to the kingdom that dissent still existed, that voices of resistance still rose, and each flame, meant to terrify, left behind a trail of questions no fire could extinguish. For the people, this became a daily reality. They prayed louder in churches, spoke more carefully at gatherings, bowed deeper before authority. But within, many carried a quiet defiance, a sense that truth must be something more than fear. The fires bred obedience, yes, but they also bred doubt. Doubt not only in rulers, but in the very system that demanded such punishments. Centuries later, when historians wrote of these queens, they often noted the cruelty of the executions. But equally important was the legacy of uncertainty they left behind. Their flames lit not only the faces of the condemned, but also the minds of the spectators, sparking doubts that smouldered for generations. In the end, the attempt to burn dissent also burned faith. Faith in rulers, faith in justice, faith in the balance of power and truth. What was meant to silence became instead a reminder that true authority cannot be built on fire alone. History often softens the memory of rulers. Cruel deeds are forgotten, victories polished, and mistakes blurred by time. Yet some queens are remembered not for their beauty, not for their wisdom, not even for their accomplishments, but for the fear they left behind. Their shadows stretch across centuries, darker than any crown's glitter, heavier than any palace stone. For those who lived under such a queen, daily life was filled with unease. The ringing of church bells, once a call to worship, could also signal a trial. The sight of soldiers in the street was not protection, but a warning. Whispers carried through markets and taverns, but always in hushed tones, for no one knew who might be listening. The Queen's agents seemed everywhere, invisible yet present, turning every careless word into potential danger. Her rule was marked by spectacles of power, trials in great halls, burnings in public squares, executions carried out with grim ceremony. Each act was designed not only to punish, but to remind her subjects that she held the authority of both crown and faith. Loyalty could never be assumed. It had to be demonstrated again and again, in prayers, in silence, in obedience. The fear she inspired was not confined to her enemies. Even those who served her most faithfully lived under its weight. Courtiers bowed deeply but trembled inwardly, never sure if today's favour might become tomorrow's ruin. Families who rose in honour one season could find themselves in disgrace the next. At her court, smiles were masks, and loyalty was tested not once but constantly. The Queen's cruelty was like a blade always hovering, unseen but always felt, and yet fear kept her throne steady. Her reign was not undone by rebellion, for none dared to rise. Her subjects learned to live within her shadow, shaping their lives to avoid notice, blending into the silence she demanded. Outwardly, the kingdom seemed orderly, unified, even devout, but beneath the surface, hearts beat with dread. When she finally passed, relief spread across the land as quietly as her fear had once spread. Bells rang again, but this time in joy. People whispered prayers of thanks, not for her rule, but for its end. In time, her successors would reshape the kingdom, but the memory of her remained like a scar, proof of what happens when power rules only through terror. Generations later, her name still carried weight. Children learned of her in stories told by firelight, not as a queen of glory, but as a warning. Historians described her not only in terms of politics and power, but in terms of fear. The silence of her subjects, the obedience of the trembling, the flames that lit her justice. She became less a person and more a symbol, a figure remembered not for love or loyalty, but for the dread she inspired. This, perhaps, is the greatest measure of cruelty, when a ruler is remembered not for what they built, but for the fear they left behind. Palaces crumble, laws change, faiths shift, but fear endures in memory, and for this queen, that was her true legacy. A reign carved not in stone, but in the trembling hearts of those who lived beneath her. History often gives us two faces of the same queen. On one side stands the noblewoman, draped in velvet, crowned with jewels, praised for her refinement, her piety, her devotion to the kingdom. On the other side lurks the nightmare, a figure of cruelty, suspicion, and fear, whose deeds left scars across her people. The truth lies somewhere between, and time has never fully decided which face we should remember. To her allies, she was a noble woman. They described her as graceful, learned, and devout. She walked through candlelit chapels with her head bowed, lips moving in silent prayer. She presided over ceremonies with elegance, her words chosen carefully, her gestures measured. She spoke of duty, of faith, of the divine burden of wearing a crown. For her supporters, she was more than a ruler. She was a symbol of order in a world of unrest, a queen who sacrificed comfort for the weight of responsibility. But for those who lived under the sharp edge of her power, the image was far darker. They saw not the noblewoman, but the nightmare. They remembered trials where accusations came faster than evidence, punishments harsher than the crime. They remembered marketplaces turned into theatres of death, where fire consumed those who resisted her rule. They remembered nights of silence, broken only by the sound of soldiers at the door. To them she was no pious guardian, but a figure whose mercy was scarce, whose justice was cloaked in cruelty. This divide was not accidental. Queens knew well the importance of appearance. They wrapped themselves in symbols of purity and devotion, even as they wielded terror behind the veil. A portrait painted in oils might show a serene face framed by golden light, yet in the same years her subjects whispered of blood, of disappearances, of fear that spread like smoke through villages. The contradiction shaped her legacy. Some chroniclers, loyal to her memory, wrote glowing accounts of her intelligence, her strength, her defence of the faith. Others recorded only the nightmare, the fires, the prisons, the years of silence. As centuries passed, the debate never ended. Was she a noblewoman, misunderstood and burdened by impossible times? Or was she a nightmare, cloaking her cruelty in the language of duty? Perhaps the answer lies in the nature of power itself. A queen was expected to rule with both firmness and grace. Too gentle, and she risked rebellion. Too harsh, and she became feared more than loved. For this queen, the balance tilted towards severity. Her noblewoman's virtues could not erase the nightmare her actions carved into memory. And so, she's remembered in both ways, as a figure of dignity in the halls of power, and as a figure of terror in the streets of her kingdom. The contrast makes her story compelling, unsettling, unforgettable. When we look back now, centuries later, we do not see only one face. We see both, the noblewoman and the nightmare, woven together in the same crown. And that is perhaps the most haunting truth of all, that a ruler can be both admired and feared, graceful and cruel, a guardian in light and a shadow in darkness. There are few legends in European history as chilling as the one that surrounds Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian noblewoman who lived in the late 16th and early 17th century. To many, she is remembered not as a patron of culture or a lady of refinement, but as the Blood Countess. The story is familiar, that she bathed in the blood of young girls, believing it would preserve her beauty. But when we slow down and look closely, we see how myth, rumour, and fear wove themselves together until the woman herself disappeared beneath the shadow of her legend. Elizabeth was born into one of the most powerful families of Hungary. She married well, lived in grand castles, and held estates that stretched across the countryside. By all accounts, she was highly educated, speaking several languages, a rarity for noblewomen of her time. Her position was secure, her influence unquestionable. Yet, beneath the surface of privilege, darker whispers gathered. As years passed, rumours began to spread about disappearances of young girls near her estates. Servants whispered of strange punishments. Villagers spoke of cruelty, and slowly the stories grew. When authorities finally investigated, they found testimonies, not of a queen bathing in blood, but of harsh discipline, imprisonment, and abuse. Dozens of witnesses described violence, though how much was truth and how much was fear amplified by gossip remains uncertain. The image of bathing in blood, however, does not appear in the earliest records. That detail grew later, carried by storytellers and pamphlet writers in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was a detail so horrifying, so vivid, that it clung to her name forever. Blood became the symbol of her cruelty, and the bath, an almost ritualistic act, transformed her from a cruel noblewoman into something closer to a vampire. Why did such a story take root? Partly because Europe at the time was fascinated by tales of witchcraft, sorcery, and the unnatural. Powerful women, especially those who fell from favour, were easy targets for such narratives. A strict and severe noblewoman could be reshaped in memory as a monster. And once the myth took hold, it spread far beyond Hungary, carried into Western Europe, into books, into plays, until centuries later, Elizabeth Bathory was no longer simply a historical figure. She had become a legend of horror. But when historians return to the records, they find a more complicated picture. There is no direct evidence she ever bathed in blood. What exists are trial documents, testimonies, some reliable, some clearly exaggerated, and political motives that suggest her downfall may have been as much about power and inheritance as about crime. Her family's wealth was vast, and her enemies stood to gain much from her disgrace. Still, the myth endures. Perhaps because the idea itself is unforgettable. A countess so obsessed with youth that she would commit the unthinkable. It speaks to human fears, of vanity, of aging, of cruelty hidden beneath elegance. Even if the details were inventions, the story resonated, echoing in Gothic novels, in folklore, and in modern tales of vampires. So when we ask, was Elizabeth Bathory truly the woman who bathed in blood? The answer is no, at least not in the literal sense, but in the imagination of Europe she always will be. The myth became more powerful than the truth, turning her life into a cautionary tale that blurs the line between history and nightmare. And perhaps that is the lasting lesson, that sometimes cruelty is remembered less for what truly happened, and more for the terrible stories people chose to believe. History has a way of transforming cruelty into legend. The further we move from the events themselves, the less clear the truth becomes. With Elizabeth Bathory, this transformation is perhaps more striking than with any other noblewoman of her age. Her name is no longer just that of a countess who ruled vast estates in Hungary. Instead, it has become a symbol, a story whispered in the language of nightmares, passed from century to century until fact and fiction can no longer be separated. In her lifetime, cruelty might have meant harsh discipline. Many noble households of the late 16th century dealt with servants through punishments we would consider brutal today. Beatings, confinement, and humiliation were not uncommon in aristocratic courts. If Bathory was more severe than most, it was enough to leave scars on the memory of those around her. Witnesses spoke of pain and fear, yet what began as rumour of mistreatment slowly grew into darker tales. After her arrest in 1610, the stories spread quickly. Servants testified, some under pressure, about bodies hidden in cellars, about chambers where girls were locked away. The details varied wildly, but each new retelling added more horror. Some claimed dozens of victims, others hundreds. And then came the most enduring twist, that Bathory bathed in the blood of the young, believing it would keep her skin smooth, her youth eternal. There is little in the earliest records to prove this, but it was the detail people remembered, because it was the most terrible. From there, cruelty became legend. The figure of the noblewoman was reshaped into something more than human. She became not just a cruel mistress, but a monster, a vampire in silk gowns, moving through candlelit halls with crimson stains hidden beneath layers of lace. Writers and chroniclers eagerly embellished the story. For them, Elizabeth Bathory was no longer a woman of history, but a warning of what vanity and unchecked power could create. Legends, after all, are more enduring than facts. A cruel act may be recorded in documents, but a legend is retold around firesides, printed in pamphlets, whispered, in villages. It spreads beyond borders, beyond time. By the 18th century, Bathory's cruelty was spoken of in places she had never set foot. By the 19th century, Gothic novelists placed her side by side with vampires and witches, blending her story into Europe's imagination of the supernatural. And so, what might have been a story of a severe and flawed noblewoman became something far larger. Cruelty had transformed into myth. Her name was no longer hers alone. It belonged to anyone who wanted to speak of darkness, of blood, of beauty purchased at too terrible a price. Even today, when historians sift through the evidence, they find themselves caught between two worlds. One is the world of the archive, where records suggest politics, inheritance disputes and exaggerations. The other is the world of legend, where Elizabeth Bathory is forever the Blood Countess, bathing in crimson pools under the flicker of torches. In truth, we may never know where cruelty ended and legend began. Perhaps she was guilty of great violence. Perhaps she was the victim of schemes designed to strip her of power. But the legend proved stronger than either possibility. It carried her name forward, not as a noblewoman, not even as a criminal, but as a symbol, a reminder that cruelty, once told and retold, rarely stays bound by the facts. It grows, it spreads, and in time it becomes the story itself. Joanna of Castile's life was never simply her own. From birth she was destined to carry dynastic hopes, to be the daughter of monarchs, the wife of a duke, the mother of heirs. And yet, even as the crown was placed upon her head, she remained bound by another role, that of a mother. To understand her tragedy, we must see how these two identities, mother and monarch, clashed and overlapped, shaping her fate in ways she could never escape. She bore 6 children with Philip the Handsome, each of whom carried extraordinary futures. Among them was Charles, who would grow to become Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, a ruler whose dominion stretched across Europe and the newly claimed lands in the Americas. To give birth to such heirs was, in itself, a victory for any queen. In the dynastic chessboard of Europe, Joanna had done more than her part. She had secured the Habsburg line for generations to come. Yet for Joanna, motherhood was no simple joy. The very children she loved became symbols of power, contested by those around her. After Philip's death, her role as mother was bound tightly to her role as monarch. Whoever controlled Joanna controlled her children, and whoever controlled her children controlled the future of Spain and the Habsburg Empire. Thus, her personal bond with her children became entangled with politics. When her son Charles rose to power, he did so through her. His claim to Castile came not from his father, but from Joanna herself, and so, while she lived, she remained the key to his authority. Yet, rather than sharing rule with her, Charles confined her at Tordesillas, ensuring that she remained queen in name only. A mother gave him his crown, and yet he made her a prisoner. Her daughters too carried heavy burdens. They were married into foreign courts, their lives used as threads in the vast tapestry of alliances that defined European politics. Joanna, once a daughter and a bride herself, now watched as her own children were drawn into the same cycle. She gave them to dynasties, not knowing if they would live as partners or pawns. And still, beneath these dynastic roles, Joanna was simply a mother who longed for her children. In confinement, she asked after them, worried over their fates, wept when they were far away. Her attendants recorded moments of tenderness, when she spoke of Charles not as emperor but as her boy, or when she remembered her daughters with longing. Even in the silence of her prison, the voice of a mother endured. It is here that her tragedy feels most human. She was a queen whose crown was used by others, and a mother whose children were taken for dynastic gain. Her love was real, but it was reshaped by politics until it no longer belonged to her alone. The crown demanded her children, and the crown demanded her silence. In the end, Joanna was both mother and monarch, but she was never allowed to be fully either. As a queen, she was stripped of power. As a mother, she was stripped of closeness. What remained was a life lived in the shadows of her own titles, remembered not for the love she bore her children, but for the suspicions that confined her. Not all queens ruled through fear or suspicion alone. Some shaped their kingdoms by another principle: discipline. Among them, Maria Theresa of Austria stands out, remembered not for cruelty in the shadows, but for the stern, structured way she built her empire. Where others wielded terror like a weapon, she relied on order, routine, and a vision of stability that was as unyielding as stone. Born in 1717, Maria Theresa inherited the vast Habsburg dominions at a time when her right to rule was challenged on all sides. Europe, filled with rivals eager to seize pieces of her empire, doubted whether a young woman could hold the throne. Yet Maria Theresa did not falter. Her strength did not lie in battlefield heroics or fiery speeches, but in something quieter, steadier: the discipline with which she organised her life and her realm. Within her household, discipline began with herself. She rose early, maintained strict schedules, and demanded the same of those around her. To her, governance was not an art of charm, but a matter of order. Every letter answered, every account reviewed, every decision weighed carefully. She believed that a monarch who could not master her own habits could never master a state. This personal discipline spilled outward into her policies. She reformed the military, demanding structure where before there had been disorder. She strengthened the bureaucracy, insisting on loyalty and efficiency from her officials. Even in education, she brought discipline, introducing systems that ensured children across her territories received the same foundation of learning. To her, discipline was not merely control, it was the backbone of a stronger future. Yet discipline, as Maria Theresa understood it, was not always gentle. Her reign carried edges of severity. She expected obedience from her subjects just as she demanded it from her family. Her own children, many of whom were married into Europe's most powerful dynasties, felt the weight of her expectations. Letters survive in which she scolded them for failing to live up to her standards, for neglecting duties, for showing weakness where she expected strength. To be her child was not only to inherit her blood, but to bear her discipline. Still, beneath the stern exterior, her purpose was clear. She wanted to preserve her empire. The Habsburg lands were a patchwork of languages, traditions, and loyalties, yet Maria Theresa held them together with her steady hand. Discipline, in her eyes, was the only way to bind such a diverse realm into unity. Without it, she believed, everything would scatter. For her contemporaries, this approach was not always comfortable. Some saw her as harsh, others as overly controlling. Yet over time, her reign became a model of stability in an age of constant war and upheaval, where neighbouring states, fractured or weakened, her empire endured. Her discipline, though often demanding, had kept the heart of her dominion beating. Looking back, we see in Maria Theresa a different kind of queenly strength. She was not the nightmare figure of legend, nor the broken widow confined by suspicion. She was a monarch who believed that order was salvation, that a ruler's duty was to shape the lives of millions through structure and routine. For her, discipline was not just a tool of rule, it was the core of it. In the story of queens, there is often a tension that never fully resolves, the pull between care and control. Maria Theresa of Austria embodied this paradox more clearly than most. To her people, she was the protective mother of the empire, a ruler who worked tirelessly for their welfare. To her children, she was the watchful matriarch, ever guiding, correcting, and commanding. In both roles, care was never separate from control. It was bound tightly, like two strands of the same thread. Maria Theresa believed deeply in the image of the monarch as a parent. She described her subjects as her children, a language that softened the harsh realities of authority. To govern, she felt, was not only to order and punish, but to nurture. She wanted schools built so that peasant children could read. She demanded hospitals and poor relief in her territories, believing that rulers bore responsibility for the weakest in their care. In this, she set herself apart from many monarchs who ruled only for wealth or glory. And yet, this maternal vision of rule had its harder side. Like a stern mother, Maria Theresa expected obedience. Education was not simply for knowledge, it was also for instilling loyalty. Her relief programs came with regulations and oversight, reminders that aid was tied to discipline. Even as she gave, she kept firm control, ensuring her people were moulded into subjects who fit the needs of her empire. Her own family reflected this balance of warmth and severity even more vividly. She was famous for her large brood, 16 children, each raised under her careful supervision. She wrote to them constantly, not only with affection but with advice that could quickly slip into commands. One child was reminded to pray more diligently, another scolded for extravagance, another warned against political missteps. To her, a loving mother was also a strict guide. Care without control, she believed, was no care at all. The most famous of her children, Marie Antoinette, would one day become Queen of France. Letters from Maria Theresa to her youngest daughter reveal both tenderness and pressure. She urged Antoinette to remember her duties, to behave with dignity, to put the crown before personal desires. It was advice born of care, but also of a mother's determination to shape her child into a tool of dynastic power. Behind the concern lay the steady hand of control. This duality defined her reign. She cared for her subjects, yes, but always as a ruler who could not forget that kindness without authority led to weakness. She cared for her children, but always as a queen who knew their marriages and alliances were instruments of empire. Her heart and her crown were never separate. Looking back, historians often struggle to decide how to see her. Was she a loving monarch who gave structure and safety to millions? Or was she a stern ruler who disguised control under the language of maternal care? Perhaps she was both, and it was in that uneasy balance that her power lay. For her people, life under Maria Theresa was like living under a strict but protective guardian. The warmth of care was always there. Schools, hospitals, reforms. But so too was the unyielding hand of authority, reminding them that all care was given on her terms. Not every queen found strength in discipline or in the role of the mother of her realm. Some resisted the very traditions that defined queenship, refusing to follow the paths set before them. Among these was Christina of Sweden, a woman whose reign in the 17th century startled her people and confounded Europe's courts. She was crowned a queen, but she lived in ways that defied every expectation of what a queen should be. Christina had inherited her throne as a child after the death of her father, Gustavus Adolphus, the great Protestant warrior king of Sweden. From the beginning, she was expected to embody the virtues of a queen, to be graceful, to prepare for marriage, to produce heirs, and to serve as a symbol of stability in a northern kingdom still shaken by war. But Christina resisted those expectations at every turn. Her first refusal came with marriage. Suitors from across Europe, princes and dukes eager to bind their fortunes with Sweden, came forward. But Christina would not choose any of them. She declared that she would not marry, that she would not be bound to a man simply because tradition required it. Her decision shocked her advisors, who feared the end of the royal line. But Christina cared more for freedom than for dynastic duty. Her second refusal lay in the very way she presented herself. She was known to dress in ways that blurred the lines between male and female, rejecting the carefully embroidered gowns and jewels that her station demanded. Instead, she often appeared in more practical clothing, even in garments that resembled those worn by men of her court. She cut her hair shorter, carried herself with a freedom that unsettled those who expected her to perform the delicate grace of a queen. In this, she made her body itself a symbol of defiance, a living rejection of the role she was supposed to play. Yet Christina was no idle rebel. She was deeply learned, a lover of philosophy, art and science. Her court became a gathering place for thinkers and writers, a space where tradition gave way to ideas that challenged the old order. In her conversations with scholars, in the books she read, she sought meaning beyond the strict roles of monarchy and religion. To her, refusing tradition was not only an act of personal defiance, but a way of opening doors to a different kind of life. The greatest shock, however, came when she refused the very throne itself. In 1654, to the astonishment of Europe, Christina abdicated. She stepped away from the crown, from the duties that had defined her since childhood, and left Sweden. For her, the crown was not a burden she wished to carry. It was a cage, and she would rather abandon it than live within the confines of tradition. Her departure caused confusion and outrage. A queen was not meant to abandon her people. Yet Christina had chosen freedom over expectation. She left behind a kingdom that did not know what to make of her, and entered history as one of its most enigmatic figures. Christina's story reminds us that not all cruelty in queenship came from punishments and fires. Sometimes the cruelty was felt by those who expected obedience, advisors, nobles, and subjects, and found only refusal. Her life unsettled Europe not because of violence, but because she dared to live beyond the roles her world had built for her. In the long story of Europe's queens, Christina of Sweden stands apart. She was not the mother, nor the widow, nor the ruler of iron discipline. She was the queen who refused tradition itself, choosing her own path in defiance of everything a crown was supposed to mean. When Christina of Sweden announced her decision to abdicate, Europe could hardly believe it. A queen stepping down from her throne was nearly unthinkable in the 17th century. Monarchs were meant to embody permanence, to be fixtures of their kingdoms, as enduring as the stones of their palaces. For a queen to lay down her crown by choice was not only rare, it was scandalous. The formal ceremony took place in June of 1654. Christina, dressed not in the shimmering robes of royalty, but in the simpler garments she preferred, renounced her throne in the city of Uppsala. Witnesses described how she laid aside the regalia of monarchy, the crown, the sceptre, the orb, symbols that had defined her since childhood. In their place, she chose freedom, declaring that she would no longer be bound by the duties that had weighed upon her. Her abdication was carefully staged, but its meaning went far beyond ceremony. To her council and nobles, it was a betrayal. For decades, Sweden had fought to secure its place among Europe's powers, and now the woman who embodied that achievement had walked away. Rumours spread quickly. Some whispered that she had grown tired of rule, others that she wished to escape the pressure to marry and produce an heir. Few could grasp the truth that Christina was not content with the role of monarch at all. And then came the scandals. Freed from the throne, Christina travelled through Europe, no longer bound by the rigid expectations of Sweden's court. She shocked those she met with her bold manner, her refusal to conform to the delicate image of a royal lady. In Rome, in Paris, in the glittering salons of Europe, she carried herself like a figure both royal and rebellious. Perhaps the greatest scandal was her conversion to Catholicism. Sweden had fought bitterly in the 30 Years' War to defend Protestantism, and Christina's father had been its great champion. For his daughter to abandon the faith of her people was seen as a betrayal deeper than abdication itself. When she declared herself a Catholic in 1655, the news rippled across Europe, transforming her from an odd queen into a symbol of religious controversy. Her personal life, too, became the subject of endless gossip. She was known for her close, and sometimes ambiguous relationships, which defied the conventions of her age. She, dressed in ways that blurred gender boundaries, spoke with boldness unfit for a woman of her time, and surrounded herself with companions whose presence fueled rumour and suspicion. Every action, every choice seemed designed to unsettle. At times, scandal followed her even into matters of blood. In 1657, during her stay in Rome, a member of her household, a man named Monaldeschi, was accused of betrayal. Christina ordered his execution inside a palace, a shocking act that stunned even her Catholic protectors. Though she denied direct cruelty, the incident left a shadow over her reputation, deepening the image of a queen who lived outside the laws of her own time. Abdication had freed Christina from the rigid traditions of Sweden, but it also cast her adrift into a Europe that was both fascinated and unsettled by her. She no longer ruled a throne, but she ruled the imagination of an age, a living scandal whose choices defied explanation. Looking back, we see in Christina's abdication more than a personal decision. It was a challenge to the very idea of monarchy, a reminder that even crowns could be set aside, and that a queen could become a scandal simply by living as herself. From the first years of her reign, it was clear that Christina of Sweden was unlike other monarchs. She had inherited her throne as a child, but as she grew into power, she revealed a spirit that was never content to sit quietly beneath the crown. Her court expected a queen who would follow tradition, rule with stability, and provide an heir to secure the dynasty. Instead, what they found was a restless spirit, brimming with energy, curiosity, and defiance. Christina filled her palace with books, scholars, and debates, rather than with endless ceremonies and dynastic celebrations. She invited philosophers, mathematicians, and artists to Stockholm, turning her northern capital into a centre of thought and learning. She delighted in long discussions on politics and philosophy, often stretching late into the night, while her counsellors fretted that the business of ruling was left unattended. She cared less for paperwork and endless councils, and more for ideas, visions, and questions that reached beyond her time. Her restlessness showed even in the way she moved through life. She was known to rise early, roam the halls of her palace, and involve herself in matters that many thought unsuitable for a queen. She sat with generals to discuss military strategies, question ministers on financial reforms, and then abandoned these duties to spend hours in study or conversation. To her critics, this was chaos. To Christina, it was freedom, the ability to move from thought to action without being caged by custom. But restlessness is not always a gift for a monarch. Sweden in the mid-17th century was an empire in need of stability. It had gained vast territories through the wars fought by Christina's father, Gustavus Adolphus. The people wanted order and continuity. They wanted a ruler who would secure alliances through marriage, ensure the strength of the royal line, and hold the gains that had cost so much blood. Instead, they had a queen who resisted marriage, who openly admitted that she had no desire to bear children, and who often allowed her personal interest to overshadow matters of state. This refusal to conform made her seem unpredictable. One day she would shower attention on a favoured courtier, raising him high in influence. The next day she would cast him aside, leaving others bewildered. Her moods, her shifting affections, her sudden bursts of energy, followed by long retreats into study, all gave her court the impression of a queen in constant motion, never still, never settled. For her people this was unsettling. For Christina it was simply who she was. Her restlessness was not an act of rebellion so much as a reflection of a spirit that could not be confined by a crown. She looked beyond her kingdom, beyond her duties, imagining a life freer and more expansive than monarchy could ever provide. Even as she sat upon the throne, she dreamed of leaving it behind. And yet, in this restlessness lay her peculiar power. She was not a queen who ruled by the predictable rhythms of tradition, nor by the harsh edges of cruelty. She ruled by a kind of turbulence, a constant stirring that forced her court to adapt, to respond, to recognise that their queen would never fit the mould. Her very refusal to sit quietly in power made her memorable, even if it left her kingdom uneasy. In the long story of her life, Christina's abdication would be the decisive act, but the seeds of that decision were planted during her reign itself, in the restless spirit that could not be satisfied by duty or crown. Even as she held power, she was already slipping away from it, her eyes fixed on a life beyond tradition, beyond Sweden, beyond the throne itself. Not every queen found strength in discipline or in the role of the mother of her realm. Some resisted the very traditions that defined queenship, refusing to follow the paths set before them. Among these was Christina of Sweden, a woman whose reign in the 17th century startled her people and confounded Europe's courts. She was crowned a queen, but she lived in ways that defied every expectation of what a queen should be. Christina had inherited her throne as a child after the death of her father, Gustavus Adolphus, the great Protestant warrior king of Sweden. From the beginning, she was expected to embody the virtues of a queen, to be graceful, to prepare for marriage, to produce heirs, and to serve as a symbol of stability in a northern kingdom still shaken by war. But Christina resisted those expectations at every turn. Her first refusal came with marriage. Suitors from across Europe, princes and dukes eager to bind their fortunes with Sweden, came forward. But Christina would not choose any of them. She declared that she would not marry, that she would not be bound to a man simply because tradition required it. Her decision shocked her advisers, who feared the end of the royal line. But Christina cared more for freedom than for dynastic duty. Her second refusal lay in the very way she presented herself. She was known to dress in ways that blurred the lines between male and female, rejecting the carefully embroidered gowns and jewels that her station demanded. Instead, she often appeared in more practical clothing, even in garments that resembled those worn by men of her court. She cut her hair shorter, carried herself with a freedom that unsettled those who expected her to perform the delicate grace of a queen. In this, she made her body itself a symbol of defiance, a living rejection of the role she was supposed to play. Yet Christina was no idle rebel. She was deeply learned, a lover of philosophy, art and science. Her court became a gathering place for thinkers and writers, a space where tradition gave way to ideas that challenged the old order. In her conversations with scholars, in the books she read, she sought meaning beyond the strict roles of monarchy and religion. To her, refusing tradition was not only an act of personal defiance, but a way of opening doors to a different kind of life. The greatest shock, however, came when she refused the very throne itself. In 1654, to the astonishment of Europe, Christina abdicated. She stepped away from the crown, from the duties that had defined her since childhood, and left Sweden. For her, the crown was not a burden she wished to carry. It was a cage, and she would rather abandon it than live within the confines of tradition. Her departure caused confusion and outrage. A queen was not meant to abandon her people. Yet Christina had chosen freedom over expectation. She left behind a kingdom that did not know what to make of her, and entered history as one of its most enigmatic figures. Christina's story reminds us that not all cruelty in queenship came from punishments and fires. Sometimes the cruelty was felt by those who expected obedience, advisors, nobles, and subjects, and found only refusal. Her life unsettled Europe not because of violence, but because she dared to live beyond the roles her world had built for her. In the long story of Europe's queens, Christina of Sweden stands apart. She was not the mother, nor the widow, nor the ruler of iron discipline. She was the queen who refused tradition itself, choosing her own path in defiance of everything a crown was supposed to mean. When Christina of Sweden announced a decision to abdicate, Europe could hardly believe it. A queen stepping down from her throne was nearly unthinkable in the 17th century. Monarchs were meant to embody permanence, to be fixtures of their kingdoms, as enduring as the stones of their palaces. For a queen to lay down her crown by choice was not only rare, it was scandalous. The formal ceremony took place in June of 1654. Christina, dressed not in the shimmering robes of royalty, but in the simpler garments she preferred, renounced her throne in the city of Uppsala. Witnesses described how she laid aside the regalia of monarchy, the crown, the sceptre, the orb, symbols that had defined her since childhood. In their place, she chose freedom, declaring that she would no longer be bound by the duties that had weighed upon her. Her abdication was carefully staged, but its meaning went far beyond ceremony. To her council and nobles, it was a betrayal. For decades, Sweden had fought to secure its place among Europe's powers, and now the woman who embodied that achievement had walked away. Rumours spread quickly. Some whispered that she had grown tired of rule, others that she wished to escape the pressure to marry and produce an heir. Few could grasp the truth that Christina was not content with the role of monarch at all. And then came the scandals. Freed from the throne, Christina travelled through Europe, no longer bound by the rigid expectations of Sweden's court. She shocked those she met with her bold manner, her refusal to conform to the delicate image of a royal lady. In Rome, in Paris, in the glittering salons of Europe, she carried herself like a figure both royal and rebellious. Perhaps the greatest scandal was her conversion to Catholicism. Sweden had fought bitterly in the 30 Years' War to defend Protestantism, and Christina's father had been its great champion. For his daughter to abandon the faith of her people was seen as a betrayal deeper than abdication itself. When she declared herself a Catholic in 1655, the news rippled across Europe, transforming her from an odd queen into a symbol of religious controversy. Her personal life, too, became the subject of endless gossip. She was known for her close, and sometimes ambiguous relationships, which defied the conventions of her age. She, dressed in ways that blurred gender boundaries, spoke with boldness unfit for a woman of her time, and surrounded herself with companions whose presence fueled rumour and suspicion. Every action, every choice seemed designed to unsettle. At times, scandal followed her even into matters of blood. In 1657, during her stay in Rome, a member of her household, a man named Monaldeschi, was accused of betrayal. Christina ordered his execution inside a palace, a shocking act that stunned even her Catholic protectors. Though she denied direct cruelty, the incident left a shadow over her reputation, deepening the image of a queen who lived outside the laws of her own time. Abdication had freed Christina from the rigid traditions of Sweden, but it also cast her adrift into a Europe that was both fascinated and unsettled by her. She no longer ruled a throne, but she ruled the imagination of an age, a living scandal whose choices defied explanation. Looking back, we see in Christina's abdication more than a personal decision. It was a challenge to the very idea of monarchy, a reminder that even crowns could be set aside, and that a queen could become a scandal simply by living as herself. From the first years of her reign, it was clear that Christina of Sweden was unlike other monarchs. She had inherited her throne as a child, but as she grew into power, she revealed a spirit that was never content to sit quietly beneath the crown. Her court expected a queen who would follow tradition, rule with stability, and provide an heir to secure the dynasty. Instead, what they found was a restless spirit, brimming with energy, curiosity, and defiance. Christina filled her palace with books, scholars, and debates, rather than with endless ceremonies and dynastic celebrations. She invited philosophers, mathematicians, and artists to Stockholm, turning her northern capital into a centre of thought and learning. She delighted in long discussions on politics and philosophy, often stretching late into the night, while her councillors fretted that the business of ruling was left unattended. She cared less for paperwork and endless councils, and more for ideas, visions, and questions that reached beyond her time. Her restlessness showed even in the way she moved through life. She was known to rise early, roam the halls of her palace, and involve herself in matters that many thought unsuitable for a queen. She sat with generals to discuss military strategies, question ministers on financial reforms, and then abandoned these duties to spend hours in study or conversation. To her critics, this was chaos. To Christina, it was freedom, the ability to move from thought to action without being caged by custom. But restlessness is not always a gift for a monarch. Sweden in the mid-17th century was an empire in need of stability. It had gained vast territories through the wars fought by Christina's father, Gustavus Adolphus. The people wanted order and continuity. They wanted a ruler who would secure alliances through marriage, ensure the strength of the royal line, and hold the gains that had cost so much blood. Instead, they had a queen who resisted marriage, who openly admitted that she had no desire to bear children, and who often allowed her personal interest to overshadow matters of state. This refusal to conform made her seem unpredictable, One day she would shower attention on a favoured courtier, raising him high in influence. The next day she would cast him aside, leaving others bewildered. Her moods, her shifting affections, her sudden bursts of energy, followed by long retreats into study, all gave her court the impression of a queen in constant motion, never still, never settled. For her people this was unsettling. For Christina it was simply who she was. Her restlessness was not an act of rebellion so much as a reflection of a spirit that could not be confined by a crown. She looked beyond her kingdom, beyond her duties, imagining a life freer and more expansive than monarchy could ever provide. Even as she sat upon the throne, she dreamed of leaving it behind. And yet, in this restlessness lay her peculiar power. She was not a queen who ruled by the predictable rhythms of tradition, nor by the harsh edges of cruelty. She ruled by a kind of turbulence, a constant stirring that forced her court to adapt, to respond, to recognise that their queen would never fit the mould. Her very refusal to sit quietly in power made her memorable, even if it left her kingdom uneasy. In the long story of her life, Christina's abdication would be the decisive act, but the seeds of that decision were planted during her reign itself, in the restless spirit that could not be satisfied by duty or crown. Even as she held power, she was already slipping away from it, her eyes fixed on a life beyond tradition, beyond Sweden, beyond the throne itself. In the grand halls of Renaissance courts, power was not always measured in armies or alliances. Sometimes it was hidden in a vial, a powder, or a cup of wine. For Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France in the 16th century, poison became a word whispered in shadows, a symbol of the fear she inspired and of the silent weapons said to lurk within her reach. Catherine had arrived in France as a young Italian bride, bringing with her the traditions and suspicions of the Florentine courts. Italy was a place where rumours of poison were as common as rumours of war, where noble families were said to settle rivalries not only with swords, but with invisible powders slipped into meals. When Catherine grew to power as queen consort, and later as regent for her sons, these stories clung to her. She did not swing swords in battle, nor march with soldiers across the fields of France. Her strength lay in patience, in strategy, and in manipulation. And in an age when assassination was never far from politics, many believed she carried poison among her tools of power. The truth is difficult to untangle. Tales of Catherine's poison cabinet spread widely, a collection of rings with hidden compartments, of perfumes laced with deadly tinctures, of letters written in invisible inks drawn from toxic herbs. Historians argue over how much of this was fact and how much was rumour, but the very persistence of these stories reveals how people saw her. To her enemies, she was a queen who killed silently, whose smile might conceal death, whose gifts might carry doom. One notorious story tells of her involvement in the death of Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre. Jeanne died suddenly in 1572, only days before the wedding of her son to Catherine's daughter. Her death was rumoured to have come from poisoned gloves, a gift said to have been prepared by Catherine's own perfumer. No proof was ever found, yet the tale stuck, woven into the web of suspicion that surrounded Catherine all her life. To those around her, poison symbolised more than death. It symbolised her ability to strike unseen, to rule not only through laws and armies, but through fear. When nobles opposed her, when courtiers whispered against her, they could never be certain that their wine, their bread, or their air was safe. The possibility of poison was itself a weapon, one that needed no proof to shape behaviour. Yet it is important to see the deeper truth behind these stories. France, in Catherine's time, was a kingdom torn by religious war, Catholics and Protestants locked in violent struggle. As regent, Catherine balanced fragile alliances, often walking a tightrope between factions ready to destroy one another. In such an atmosphere, fear was a kind of power, and the rumours of poison, whether true or not, gave her the aura of a queen not to be crossed. The silent weapon of poison, real or imagined, became part of Catherine's legend. It made her seem untouchable, a figure who ruled not, only in daylight councils but in the hidden corners of night. To her enemies she was the queen of shadows, her hands stained with invisible crimes. To her supporters she was simply a ruler who did what she must to keep the kingdom from collapse. Centuries later, when people remember Catherine de' Medici, they still recall the whispers of poison. Whether she truly used it or not matters less than the way it shaped her reputation. In her court, silence itself could be deadly, and poison, the most silent weapon of all, became the symbol of her reign. The French court in the 16th century was a place of glittering banquets, whispered plots, and ever-shifting loyalties. Beneath the music and the dancing, beneath the candlelight and the laughter, danger often lingered. For Catherine de' Medici, queen and later regent, such gatherings were not only displays of splendour, but also arenas of power, and to those who feared her, every banquet seemed to carry the shadow of a poisoned cup. In Catherine's world, food and drink were never just nourishment. They were symbols of trust, tokens of favour, and sometimes weapons. Guests at her tables were expected to marvel at the richness of the feast, the exotic dishes, the wines poured into golden cups. Yet behind the sparkle of silver and the aroma of roasted meats, unease always stirred. A sip too bitter, a dish too unusual, and whispers would rise. Had the Queen chosen this meal as a test or as a death sentence? Stories multiplied in her lifetime and long after. Nobles who opposed her, it was said, fell ill after dining at her banquets. Courtiers whispered of rings with hidden compartments, filled with powders that could be slipped into a goblet unnoticed. One tale claimed that Catherine's perfumer, René, created both fragrances and poisons, serving as the hidden hand behind her deadly reputation. Another told of secret banquets where rivals never returned alive. The most infamous rumour surrounded the preparations for the saint, Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572. Catherine, accused by her enemies of orchestrating the slaughter of Protestants, was said to have held banquets where plans were made and cups were laced with venom for those who resisted. Though evidence for such poisonings remains scarce, the stories painted a picture of a court where dinner could be as dangerous as battle. Why were these tales so powerful? Partly because the French court was already a place of intrigue, where alliances shifted as quickly as the flicker of a candle. Guests smiled across tables at men and women they secretly despised, toasted to the health of rivals they hoped to see dead. Poison fit this atmosphere perfectly. It was the unseen blade, the assassin that required no duel, and Catherine, with her Italian background and her reputation for cunning, became the perfect figure onto whom such fears could be projected. For her, whether the poison tales were true or not, they worked to her advantage. Fear was a tool of control, and the threat of poison, whispered, unseen, never proven, could silence opposition without a single drop being spilled. A noble who doubted her might think twice before accepting her wine. A courtier who plotted against her might wonder whether his next meal would be his last. Rumour itself became as deadly as any cup, but there was a cost. These stories clung to Catherine long after her death, turning her into the Black Queen, the mistress of shadows and poison. They obscure the truth that much of her reign was spent desperately trying to hold France together during its wars of religion, balancing Catholics and Protestants in a fragile peace. Her banquets, her courtly splendour were meant to display unity. Yet for centuries they were remembered instead as stages for intrigue and death. In the quiet candlelit halls of her palaces, where silver cups once gleamed and guests raised their glasses, a question always lingered. Was this a toast to life, or the beginning of death? And in that uncertainty lay Catherine's lasting legacy, a queen forever linked to court intrigues and deadly cups. In a world of swords and armies, danger was often visible. A soldier could see the enemy across the battlefield, hear the clash of steel, and know where death might strike. But at the French court in the 16th century, fear often came not from the open field, but from the unseen. Catherine de' Medici's reign was haunted by the idea of invisible enemies, threats that could not be fought with armour or steel, but might arrive silently in a sip of wine or a breath of perfume. It was an age when medicine and science were still wrapped in mystery. Illnesses struck without warning, fevers raged through noble houses, and the line between natural sickness and deliberate poisoning blurred. If a duke fell ill after attending a banquet, was it the plague, an infection, or the queen's hidden hand? No one could be sure. This uncertainty created a culture of suspicion, where invisible dangers seemed to lurk in every corner. At Catherine's court, these fears took on a life of their own. Every object might conceal a weapon. Perfumed gloves, it was whispered, could be laced with deadly powders that seeped into the skin. Letters might be written with invisible ink made of venom. Even the very air of a room, scented with exotic oils, could raise suspicion. Guests approached her with caution, wondering if the gift she offered was a token of favour or a trap. Paranoia grew with each unexplained death. Catherine's enemies claimed she kept a cabinet of poisons filled with rare substances brought from Italy, ready to be used against anyone who defied her. Some swore she employed astrologers and alchemists to predict the moment when her rivals were weakest, striking not with open war but with invisible forces. Whether or not these tales were true mattered less than the fear they inspired, and fear, once planted, spread quickly. Courtiers became wary of eating food they had not seen prepared. Noblemen travelled with tasters, servants whose sole task was to sip the wine first or taste the meat before their master dared. To refuse the Queen's hospitality was dangerous. It could be seen as an insult, even an act of rebellion. Yet to accept it was to gamble with one's life. In this way, invisible enemies ruled the court as effectively as any army. For Catherine herself, this climate of fear was both a shield and a burden. She was blamed for plots she may never have devised, painted as a sorceress, a mistress of shadows, a queen whose power was rooted in mystery. But the reality was more complex. France in her time was a nation tearing itself apart with religious wars, Catholic against Protestant, family against family. Poison and rumour became weapons in this struggle, tools as effective as armies or diplomacy. The legacy of these fears lasted long beyond her death. Even centuries later, writers and storytellers repeated the tales of poisoned gloves, toxic perfumes, and invisible deaths. Catherine was remembered not only as a ruler, but as a symbol of the unseen, the idea that true danger often cannot be seen, only feared. In the grand halls of the Louvre, where once her banquets glittered and music filled the air, her memory lingers like a shadow. For those who lived in her time, the fear of invisible enemies was not just a story but a daily reality, a reminder that in the courts of power, trust was fragile, and danger might come not from the clash of swords, but from the silent touch of something no one could see. History is often written in chronicles, in grand books of battles, treaties, and royal decrees, but some of the most enduring memories do not survive on parchment. They pass instead from mouth to ear, in whispers exchanged behind closed doors, in stories murmured by servants, in rumours carried through taverns and marketplaces. For queens remembered as cruel, it was these whispers that shaped their legacy more powerfully than official records ever could. At court, the whispers were everywhere. Ladies-in-waiting lowered their voices as they spoke of the Queen's sudden anger, of her eyes flashing like steel, of punishments handed out without hesitation. Courtiers leaned closer to one another at feasts, telling tales of poisoned rings and secret letters, their words lost beneath the music but their meaning sharp enough to cut. To speak too loudly was dangerous, yet to remain silent was impossible. Fear itself needed release, and whispers became the only safe way to express it. Beyond the palace walls, the stories grew even darker. Market vendors repeated what they had heard from travellers, that a queen bathed in blood to preserve her beauty, or that she summoned shadows to carry out her will. Villagers told children to behave, warning them that if they disobeyed, the queen's men might come in the night. What began as rumour soon became legend, embroidered and retold until no one could separate fact from invention. For the people who lived under her rule, these whispered stories served a purpose. They were a way to explain the unexplainable. Why had a nobleman died suddenly after falling from favour? Why did neighbours vanish without warning, their homes left empty and silent? The official explanations rarely satisfied. Whispers offered another answer, one filled with hidden hands and secret cruelty. These stories also travelled further than any royal decree. Soldiers carried them from town to town, merchants carried them across borders, and soon the Queen's name became infamous even in lands she had never set foot in. Some admired her cunning, seeing in the whispers proof of her strength. Others condemned her, convinced she was less a monarch and more a monster. The whispers outlasted her reign. Long after the Queen was gone, they continued to circulate, reshaped to fit new fears and new generations. Historians might argue over the truth, yet the people remembered the rumours more vividly than the facts. A cruel queen, once whispered about in candlelit halls, became a figure larger than life, half woman, half myth, remembered not only for what she did, but for what people believed she might have done. There is something haunting about this. Power, for all its glittering crowns and jewelled thrones, is fragile. What endures is not always the laws a queen passed or the treaties she signed, but the stories told about her in hushed tones. Whispers carried her memory farther than her armies ever could, and so, even today, when we speak of these queens, we repeat the whispers, sometimes without realizing it. We picture them as legends of cruelty, as shadows moving through gilded halls, as nightmares in human form. Whether true or not hardly matters. What matters is that the whispers survived, stronger than silence, stronger than time. Every crown carries weight. It is not only the weight of gold, or of the precious stone set into its band, it is the weight of memory, of what came before. For queens and kings who inherited thrones once ruled by figures of cruelty, the past was never silent. It lingered like a shadow across their reign, shaping how people saw them and how they ruled themselves. A queen remembered for cruelty leaves behind more than laws or monuments. She leaves behind scars, not on the land, but on the hearts of her people. When a new monarch took the throne, those scars did not fade overnight. The whispers of past horrors still circled through the court. Old servants remembered punishments delivered without mercy. Noble families recalled relatives who had fallen victim to suspicion or ambition. Ordinary villagers spoke of flames in the marketplace, of prisons that never opened. This was the shadow of the past, an inheritance no crown could escape. Even when a new queen tried to show mercy, her subjects measured her against the memory of the cruel ruler before her. A gesture of kindness was received with hesitation. Was it genuine, or just the mask before the nightmare returned? Suspicion clung to every act, because people had learned to fear the throne as much as they respected it. For rulers, this shadow was both a burden and a warning. Some tried to push against it to reshape their image, to prove that their reign would be different. They gave gifts, they reduced punishments, they smiled in public processions. Yet the shadow lingered. Too much leniency, and the crown appeared weak. Too much severity, and the whispers began again, comparing them to the queen who had ruled with fire and fear. Others embraced the shadow. They wore cruelty as armour, believing fear was safer than love. In their minds, history had shown that kindness was quickly forgotten, but terror lasted for generations. By choosing severity, they accepted the shadow as part of their crown, adding new layers to it, deepening the darkness for those who would inherit the throne after them. The shadow also reached beyond politics. It touched families, shaping dynasties. Children of cruel queens often grew up haunted by the stories told of their mothers. They learned early that their family name carried not only honour but dread. For some, this inspired distance, a desperate attempt to live differently, to escape the legacy of fear. For others, it planted seeds of suspicion, teaching them that power and mercy could never coexist. Over time, the shadow of cruelty became part of the very identity of the crown itself. Even centuries later, historians and storytellers looked back at certain thrones and remembered not only the rulers who built or healed or guided, but above all the queens who ruled with terror. Their stories cast such a long shadow that every successor, no matter how gentle, lived partly within it. And so, the crown is never just a symbol of the present. It carries the weight of yesterday's fire, yesterday's whispers, yesterday's fear. To wear it is to live not only with one's own choices, but also with the memory of choices made long before. The shadow of the past does not fade. It lingers, silent and heavy, reminding each new queen that her crown is not only hers to shape, it is a reflection of all who wore it before, for better or for worse. When a queen dies, the bells toll, the court dons black, and the crown passes to another. Her body rests in stone tombs, her name inscribed in gilded letters on monuments. Yet sometimes, what she leaves behind is not only marble and memory. Sometimes she leaves fear, and that fear continues to live long after her final breath. The people who once trembled before her punishments do not suddenly feel safe when the coffin is lowered into the earth. Fear does not die with its source. It lingers in silence woven into habits, stories and traditions. A villager who once whispered against the throne learns to keep his voice quiet, even under gentler rulers. A noble family scarred by executions in the past teaches its children never to trust too deeply, never to stand too boldly. Fear passes from one generation to the next, a shadow written not in books, but in human behaviour. In the villages, tales of cruel queens were told by firelight. Parents warned their children of rulers who burned, who poisoned, who punished without mercy. Even centuries later, these stories were repeated, sometimes as history, sometimes as folklore, always as caution. Remember, the elders said, power is never safe. The names of the queens became symbols of terror, their cruelty magnified by retelling, their reigns transformed into lessons about the dangers of unchecked rule. At court, the fear was quieter, but no less enduring. Long after such queens were gone, courtiers still remembered the sudden glances, the whispered accusations, the swift justice that left no room for defence. The halls themselves seemed haunted, filled with memories of feasts where smiles concealed suspicion, of chambers where decisions were made in secrecy, of prisons never emptied. New monarchs might try to bring light, but the courtiers carried memories like invisible chains. They had seen too much to ever forget. Historians, too, helped preserve the fear. Chroniclers who lived in those times often exaggerated, writing of shadows, poisons, and endless cruelty. Later writers, centuries removed, repeated these tales because they captivated readers. The queens themselves became almost larger than life, half ruler, half myth, remembered less for the reality of their governance and more for the fear they inspired. Their cruelty lived on in words, spreading across borders and languages, far beyond the lands they had ever ruled. This endurance of fear shows a strange truth about power. Mercy can be forgotten, but cruelty rarely fades. Kind acts vanish in the rush of time, while fear plants roots in memory. The queens who ruled with terror ensured that their presence would outlast their lives, though not in the way they might have hoped. Instead of honour, they left unease. Instead of devotion, they left dread. Even now, when we speak of them, the fear is still there. Their names call to mind fire and poison, prisons and whispers. We may not tremble as their subjects once did, but we remember, and in remembering, we keep the fear alive. Thus, long after the queens themselves were laid to rest, their cruelty endures, not in crowns or palaces, but in the hearts of those who tell their stories. Fear outlived them, and in many ways it became their most lasting legacy.